The FBI echoed President Biden's recent warnings of possible Russian cyber attacks. FBI Director Christopher Wray says the Bureau is on alert for cyber attacks.
We are, of course, concerned about the possibility, as the President said, of the Russians, whether it's their intelligence services or cyber criminal groups working with them, targeting U.S. critical infrastructure, either in retaliation for our sanctions or for some other means.
President Joe Biden this week urged U.S. companies to make sure their digital doors are locked tight, warning that Russia could launch cyber attacks against critical targets in the country. Wray doubled down on those warnings. The FBI has continuously monitored how Russians operate, but what the FBI is working on now is related to the heightened tensions between Russia and the U.S. Long before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the federal government warned U.S. companies of the threat from Russian hackers. And this week, those warnings went even further. The White House is now warning of a potential attack on our critical infrastructure. The administration has not laid out any specific cyber threats, but the intelligence community says they've seen the Russian government exploring vulnerable spots in our electric grid. Here to unpack the details, we have documentary film producer David Tice. David, you produced a documentary about the vulnerability of our electric grid. Based on your wealth of knowledge about this, can you tell us, are we in a very vulnerable position right now when it comes to Russian cyber attacks?
Yes, Melina, we're in an incredibly vulnerable position. I did this documentary about the power grid and the civilian infrastructure. And essentially, we have four big adversaries: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And all of them have talked about the fact that they could potentially bring down our power grid and therefore affect U.S. civilians.
President Biden has said this week that the magnitude of Russia's cyber capacity is fairly consequential. Now, what can you tell us about these consequences? What does a cyber attack on critical infrastructure mean to everyday Americans?
Well, certainly it depends on the magnitude of the cyber attack. Our major adversaries have significant potential to be able to wipe out our power grid. In fact, we had Jennifer Granholm, who's the Secretary of DOE, currently was on a Sunday talk show recently and mentioned that our adversaries are already inside our grid, and therefore they could essentially turn out the lights. If they can knock out our critical transformers and our SCADA, essentially that could cause a longer-term power outage. If our power outage goes out for 6 months or so, which is certainly possible, and our adversaries do have that type of capability, it could cause as many as 250 million Americans to die. And you think that might sound crazy. However, we require our water systems, require electricity. Our food supply is going to require electricity. And therefore, people will die if they don't have water after 3 days. And therefore, our documentary at Grid Down, Power Up talks about all these threats and talks about the fact that we need to defend our power grid and our civilian infrastructure.
Now, David, you just mentioned all of these very risky consequences that we would face. Why haven't we been more prepared? You say that our adversaries are already in our electric grid.
Well, frankly, it reminds me a lot of the pandemic, where we had studies and, frankly, we did not have enough masks ready. We did not have enough ventilators. Essentially, government tends to not be prepared for these ultimate catastrophes. And frankly, one of the big issues is our public utilities have not been regulated sufficiently. And although I am a less regulation kind of guy, frankly, our public utilities or electric companies have pretty much been self-regulated, and there needs to be an overhaul of that regulation. Essentially, our military has become hardened against a potential attack from cyber attack and electromagnetic pulse attack. However, our civilian infrastructure has not been given that same attention.
So speaking of those consequences, Biden also said this week that this threat is coming. He said that it seemed like he affirmatively said that. Do you agree with that? Do you think that this is something we can affirmatively say?
Well, we don't know for sure, Melina. It's certainly Vladimir Putin is putting some threats out there. And dependent upon how America acts and if NATO acts, if we decide to invoke a no-fly zone, then they could certainly try an attack and bring down the power grid in a couple different cities, or they could this could truly mark the onset of World War III. And therefore, there is a huge risk here. We hope to prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and leave God to the rest.
Thank you so much for your expertise and all of your explanations, David.
Thank you.
House Republicans are holding a 3-day retreat in Florida starting today. They're focusing on policy priorities, keeping in mind that they could regain the majority after the midterm elections. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich will speak this evening. Former President Trump is not on the schedule, but is expected to attend a GOP fundraiser in May. House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy says that Republican task forces have been going out to listen to the public, and based on that feedback, they rolled out new initiatives, including the Parents' Bill of Rights and border security.
Our members have been not just working through those task forces, we've been doing conferences every single week where everybody's invited based upon a different topic, from making America energy independent.
The Republican lawmakers will narrow down the topics for issue-focused discussions during the retreat. U.S. officials today formally declared that Russia has committed war crimes. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Moscow has violated the laws of conflict by launching aimless attacks, and Russian forces are deliberately targeting civilians. And we've seen some of those videos and photos of apartment buildings, school buildings, and hospitals being destroyed. Your regular host, Steve Lance, sat down with Congressman Buddy Carter in Florida today to hear his thoughts about this.
Congressman Buddy Carter, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report again.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Congressman, I want to get your thoughts. The United States has just formally accused Russia of war crimes in Ukraine for what's taking place there. I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, it's totally expected. I mean, we've seen it. This is a war that's being fought on social media. It's being fought in real time. We see it on TV. We see what happens. You've seen the bombing of a hospital, even when the Ukrainians had put in Russian children. And to clarify that they were there, and yet the Russians paid no attention whatsoever to what was going on here. So we've witnessed it firsthand. We've seen these war crimes, and yeah, it's high time we've done this, and past time that we did it.
Now, what is your response to the U.S.'s response to what's happened in Ukraine thus far? And do you believe the Biden administration has sent a strong enough message to the Kremlin? Well,
certainly we're hitting them where it hurts right now, and that is in oil and gas. Let's face it, Russia is nothing more than a gas station masquerading as a country. I think it took too long for the Biden administration to impose sanctions on Russian oil. However, it's never too late to do the right thing, so they have done the right thing, and this is what's going to get their attention, and this is what's going to hurt them. Now, I would call on other countries, such as India, that are still buying Russian oil, that they need to do the same thing that we've done, and that is stop buying Russian oil. We'll have to make sure that we are protecting the people of Ukraine in any way that we can, and certainly with economic sanctions like this, that helps them.
Now, speaking of oil, you've introduced a bill that's garnering some national attention right now with regard to the Keystone XL pipeline. Can you tell us exactly what's going on?
Ending dependency on Russian energy. And what it does is to simply start the Keystone pipeline back. And we need to start it back. Let's face it, the Biden administration has had a war on energy independence, a war on fossil fuels since day one. The first thing he did was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. What this bill will do is to start the Keystone XL pipeline. We also need to open up drilling on federal lands. We need to end all of this bureaucracy and that is surrounding the permitting and leasing of these lands. That is extremely important. We need to unleash the natural resources that we have here in America.
And why do you think even before President Biden took office, the Democrats were so against this?
Well, I think it's their way of addressing climate change. And certainly we want to address climate change as well. However, we have to do it in a way where we're using an all-of-the-above type energy strategy. We are not to the point now we can do away with fossil fuels, and we're not going to be at that point in the very near future. We have to make sure that we're utilizing fossil fuels to the full extent that we can. Otherwise, we're going to hurt our economy. It's going to hurt the people who can afford it the least, the middle class, the working class.
And on that note, right now we're seeing the potential issues with the food supply. Fertilizer is starting to become. What are you hearing from your constituents just on the energy front in general?
Absolutely. We have been getting phone calls. We've been getting texts. I represent South Georgia, a lot of rural area, a lot of forestry. I had a logger call me. He owns a logging company. He said, look, I can't afford these petroleum prices. They're going to put me out of business. I'm just simply not going to be able to do it. Had a farmer call me the other day. I cannot afford fertilizer. Therefore, I'm not going to be able to plant a crop this year. Had a single mom send me a text. She said, I cannot afford to go to work, but I can't afford not to go to work. What am I going to do?
Congressman Buddy Carter, thank you.
Thank you.
Alaska will hold a special election to replace late Congressman Don Young. Young died last Friday, leaving his seat vacant. Officials are planning for a vote-by-mail primary election on June 11th. They say that mail-in voting is the only way to hold the primary election on such short notice. Voters will also be able to vote in person. The general election will be a race among 4 final candidates. It's planned for mid-August. The state will have its first ranked choice election where voters will be able to rank those top 4 candidates. Moderna shot could be administered to America's youngest population if the FDA approves it. Moderna's COVID vaccine works for kids under the age of 6, the company announced today. The drug company wants to authorize 2 small-dose shots for this age group and is asking regulators in the U.S. and Europe to approve it. Moderna also hopes to have larger doses cleared for older kids and teens. Early vaccine study results found that young kids developed virus-fighting antibodies from smaller-sized doses. However, the vaccine was not very effective in combating Omicron.
The really good news is we met the primary endpoints of that study, meaning that the vaccine provides the same level of protection against COVID in young kids as it does in adults.
The study wasn't large enough to detect very rare side effects. The FDA has not approved Moderna's teen shots yet, due to concerns of a rare vaccine side effect, heart inflammation, sometimes occurring in mostly male young adults.